Good evening. Welcome to us all tonight. My name is Felix Lebeski, and we have 4 short accounts from the American frontier. Not legends, not campfire tales, just the kind of quiet, stubborn reports that never quite sit right. Ambrose Bierce collected them the same way he collected everything else, bold, precise, and without comfort. He was a hard man to like. That never stopped him from seeing clearly. Tonight, we take 4 of those reports in turn. First, a simple walk across an open field. The difficulty of crossing a field. One morning in July 1854, a planter named Williamson, living 6 miles from Selma, Alabama, was sitting with his wife and child on the veranda of his dwelling. Immediately in front of the house was a lawn, perhaps 50 yards in extent between the house and public road, or, as it was called, the pike. Beyond this road lay a close-cropped pasture of some 10 acres, level, and without a tree, rock, or any natural or artificial object on its surface. At the time, there was not even a domestic animal in the field. In another field, beyond the pasture, a dozen slaves were at work under an overseer. Throwing away the stump of a cigar, the planter rose, saying, "I forgot to tell Andrew about those horses." Andrew was the overseer. Williamson strolled leisurely down the gravel walk, plucking a flower as he went, passed across the road and into a pasture, pausing a moment as he closed the gate leading into it, to greet a passing neighbor, Farmer Wren, who lived on an adjoining plantation. Mr. Wren was in an open carriage with his son James, a lad of 13. When he had driven some 200 yards from the point of meeting, Mr. Wren said to his son, "I forgot to tell Mr. Williamson about those horses." Mr. Wren had sold to Mr. Williamson some horses, which were to have been sent for that day. But for some reason, not now remembered, it would be inconvenient to deliver them until the morrow. The coachman was directed to drive back, and as the vehicle turned, Williamson was seen by all 3 walking leisurely across the pasture. At that moment, one of the coach horses stumbled and came near falling. It had no more than fairly recovered itself when James Wren cried, "Why, father, what has become of Mr. Williamson?" It is not the purpose of this narrative to answer that question. Mr. Wren's strange account of the matter, given under oath in the course of legal proceedings related to the Williamson estate, here follows. My son's exclamation caused me to look towards the spot where I had seen the deceased sick an instant before. But he was not there, nor was he anywhere visible. I cannot say that at the moment I was greatly startled or realized the gravity of the occurrence, though I thought it singular. My son, however, was greatly astonished and kept repeating his question in different forms until we arrived at the gate. My boy Sam was similarly affected, even in a greater degree, but I reckon more by my son's manner than by anything he had himself observed. The sentence in the testimony was stricken now. As we got out of the carriage at the gate of the field, and while Sam was hanging, sick, the team to the fence, Miss Williamson and her child in her arms, followed by several servants, came running down the walk in great excitement, crying, "He's gone! He's gone! Oh God, what a wonderful thing, awful thing!" and many other such exclamations, which I do not distinctly recollect. I got from them the impression that they related to something more than the mere disappearance of her husband, even if that had occurred before her eyes. Her manner was wild, but not more so, I think, than was natural under the circumstances. I have no reason to think she had at the time lost her mind. I have never since seen nor heard of Mr. Williamson. This testimony, as might have been expected, was corroborated in almost every particular by the only other eyewitness, that is a proper term, the lad James. Mrs. Williamson had lost her reason, and the servants were, of course, not competent to testify. The boy, James Wren, had declared at first that he saw the disappearance, but there's nothing of this in his testimony given in court. None of the field hands working in the field to which Williamson was going had seen him at all, and the most rigorous search of the entire plantation and adjoining country failed to supply a clue. The most monstrous and grotesque fictions, originating with the blacks, were current in that part of the state for many years, and probably are to this day. But what had been here related is all that is certainly known of the matter. The courts decided that Williamson was dead, and his estate was distributed according to the law. Some vanishes leave no mark at all. Others leave a mark that refuses to stay buried. Our next account begins with a peddler who never finished his route, and the man who was still standing on the bridge years later. Present at a hanging. An old man named Daniel Baker, living near Lebanon, Iowa, was suspected by his neighbors of having murdered a peddler who had obtained permission to pass the night at his house. This was in 1853, when peddling was more common in the western country than it is now, and was attended with considerable danger. The peddler with his pack traversed the country by all manner of lonely roads, and was compelled to rely upon the country people for hospitality. This brought him into relation with queer characters, some of whom were not altogether scrupulous in their methods of making a living, murder being an acceptable means to that end. It occasionally occurred that a peddler with a diminished pack and swollen purse would be traced to the lonely dwelling of some rough character, and never could be traced beyond. This was so in the case of Old Man Baker, as he was always called. Such names are given in the western settlements only to elderly persons who are not esteemed. To the general disrepute of social unworth is affixed the special reproach of age. A peddler came to his house and none went away. That is all anyone knew. 7 years later, the Reverend Mr. Cummings, a Baptist minister well known in that part of the country, was driving by Baker's farm one night. It was not very dark. There was a bit of moon somewhere above the light veil of mist that lay along the earth. Mr. Cummings, who was at all times a cheerful person, was whistling a tune, which he would occasionally interrupt to speak a word of friendly encouragement to his horse. As he came to a little bridge across a dry ravine, he saw the figure of a man standing upon it, clearly outlined against the gray background of a misty forest. The man had something strapped on his back and carried a heavy stick, obviously an itinerant peddler. His attitude had in it a suggestion of abstraction, like that of a sleepwalker. Mr. Cummings reined in his horse when he arrived in front of him, gave him a pleasant salutation, and invited him to a seat in the vehicle. "If you're going my way," he added. The man raised his head, looked him full in the face, but neither answered nor made any further movement. The minister, with good-natured persistence, repeated his invitation. At this, the man threw his right hand forward from his side and pointed downward as he stood on the extreme edge of the bridge. Mr. Cummings looked past him, over into the ravine, saw nothing unusual, and withdrew his eyes to address the man again. He had disappeared. The horse, which all this time had been uncommonly restless, gave at the same moment a snort of terror and started to run away. Before he had regained control of the animal, the minister was at the crest of the hill 100 yards along. He looked back and saw the figure again, at the same place and in the same attitude as when he had first observed it. Then, for the first time, he was conscious of a sense of the supernatural, and drove home as rapidly as his willing horse would go. On arriving at home, he related his adventure to his family, and early the next morning, accompanied by 2 neighbors, John White Corwell and Abner Razor, returned to the spot. They found the body of Old Man Baker hanging by the neck from one of the beams of the bridge, immediately beneath the spot where the apparition had stood. A thick coating of dust, slightly dampened by the mist, covered the floor of the bridge, but the only footprints were those of Mr. Cummings' horse. In taking down the body, the men disturbed the loose, friable earth of the slope below it, disclosing human bones already nearly uncovered by the action of water and frost. They were identified as those of the lost peddler. At the double inquest, the coroner's jury found that Daniel Baker died by his own hand while suffering from temporary insanity, and that Samuel Moritz was murdered by some person or persons to the jury unknown.
I stood upon a hill, the setting sun was crimson with a curse and a portent. Scarce his angry ray lit up the land where bodiless voices babbled in the gloom. Imperfect witness to the crime, a phantom world preserved in time. The evidence remains unread, silent and desolate, the sea is dead. The sea is dead. Long dusty fissures clove the open plain, a sudden void where footprints leave no stain. The room is locked, the window boarded tight, a shadow standing in an uncanny light. Imperfect witness to the crime, a phantom world preserved in time. The evidence remains unread, silent and desolate, the sea is dead. I know not if it was a dream, a strange and melancholy land. No soul but I alone to mark the fear, no record found within the dossier. Evidence remains unread, silent and desolate, the sea is dead. The unclosed file, bodiless voices, imperfect witness.
A boarded window is rarely just a boarded window, especially when no one still living can remember why it was nailed shut in the first place. This is the boarded window. In 1830, only a few miles away from what is now the great city of Cincinnati, lay an immense and almost unbroken forest. The whole region was sparsely settled by people of the frontier, restless souls who no sooner had hewn fairly habitable homes out of the wilderness and attained to that degree of prosperity which today we should call indigence, than, impelled by some mysterious impulsive of their nature, they abandoned all and pushed further westward to encounter new perils and privations in the effort to regain the meager comforts which they had voluntarily renounced. Many of them had already forsaken that region for the remoter settlements, but among those remaining was one who had been of those first arriving. He lived alone in a house of logs surrounded on all sides by the great forest, of whose gloom and silence he seemed a part, for no one had ever known him to smile, nor speak a needless word. His simple wants were supplied by the sale or barter of skins of wild animals in the river town, for not a thing did he grow upon the land, which, if needful, he might have claimed by right of undisturbed possession. There were evidences of improvement. A few acres of ground immediately about the house had once been cleared of its trees, the decaying stumps of which were half concealed by the new growth that had been suffered to repair the ravage wrought by the axe. Apparently the man's zeal for agriculture had burned with a failing flame, expiring in penitential ashes. The little log house with its chimney of sticks, its roof of warping clapboards weighted with traversing poles, and its chinking of clay, had a single door, and directly opposite a window. The latter, however, was boarded up. Nobody could remember a time when it was not, and none knew why it was so closed, certainly not because of the occupant's dislike of light and air, for on those rare occasions when a hunter had passed that lonely spot, the recluse had commonly been seen sunning himself on his doorstep if heaven had provided sunshine for his need. I fancy there are few persons living today who ever knew the secret of that window, but I am one, as you shall see. The man's name was said to be Murlock. He was apparently 70 years old, actually about 50. Something besides years had had a hand in his aging. His hair and long, full beard were white, his gray, lustrous eyes sunken. His face singularly seamed with wrinkles which appeared to belong to two intersecting systems. In figure he was tall and spare, with a stoop of the shoulders, a burden bearer. I never saw him. These particulars I learned from my grandfather, from whom also I got the man's story when I was a lad. He had known him when living nearby in that early day. One day Murlock was found in his cabin, dead. It was not a time and place for coroners and newspapers, and I suppose it was agreed that he had died from natural causes, or I should have been told, and should remember. I know only that what was probably a sense of the fitness of things, the body was buried near the cabin, alongside the grave of his wife, who had preceded him by so many years that local tradition had retained hardly a hint of her existence. That closes the final chapter of this true story, excepting, indeed, the circumstance that many years afterwards, in company with the equal intrepid spirit, I penetrated to the place and ventured near enough to the ruined cabin to throw a stone against it, and ran away to avoid the ghost witch. Every well-informed boy thereabout knew haunted the spot, but there is an earlier chapter, that supplied by my grandfather. When Murlock built his cabin and began laying sturdily about with his axe to hew out a farm, the rifle, meanwhile, his means of support, he was young, strong, and full of hope. In that eastern country whence he came, he had married, as was the fashion, a young woman in all ways worthy of his honest devotion, who shared the dangers and privations of his lot with a willing spirit and light heart. There is no known record of her name, of her charms, and mind and person. Tradition is silent, and the doubter is at liberty to entertain his doubt, but God forbid that I should share it. Of their affection and happiness there is abundant assurance in every added day of the man's widowed life, for what but the magnetism of a blessed memory could have chained that venturesome spirit to a lot like that? One day Murlock returned from gunning in a distant part of the forest to find his wife prostrate with fever and delirious. There was no physician within miles, no neighbor, nor was she in a condition to be left to summon help. So he set about the task of nursing her back to health, but at the end of the third day she fell into unconsciousness, and so Arid so passed away, apparently with never a gleam of returning reason. From what we know of a nature like his, we may venture to sketch in some of the details of an outline picture drawn by my grandfather. When convinced that she was dead, Murlock had sense enough to remember that the dead must be prepared for burial. In performance of the sacred duty he blundered now and again, did certain things incorrectly, and others which he did correctly were done over and over. His occasional failures to accomplish some an ordinary act filled him with astonishment, like that of a drunken man who wonders at the suspension of familiar natural laws. He was surprised, too, that he did not weep, surprised and a little ashamed. Thirdly, it's unkind not to weep for the dead. "Tomorrow," he said aloud, I shall have to make the coffin arid, dig the grave, and then I shall miss her, when she is no longer in sight. But now, she is dead, of course, but it is all right. It must be all right, somehow. Things cannot be so bad as they seem. He stood over the body in the fading light, adjusting the hair and putting the finishing touches to his simple toilet, doing all mechanically with soulless care. And still through his consciousness ran an undersense of conviction that was all right, that he should have her again as before, and everything explained. He had had no experience in grief. His capacity had not been enlarged by use. His heart could not contain it all, nor his imagination rightly conceive it. He did not know he was so hard-struck. The knowledge would come later, and never go. Grief is an artist of powers as various as instruments upon which he played his dirges for the dead, evoking from some the sharpest, shrillest notes, from others the lowest grave chords that throb recurrent like the slow beating of a distant drum. Some natures it startles, some it stupefies. To one it comes like the stroke of an arrow, stinging all of the sensibilities to a keener life, to another as the blow of a bludgeon, went in crushing the numbs. We may conceive Murlock to have been that way affected, for, and here we are upon surer ground than that of conjecture, no sooner had he finished his pious work than, sinking into a chair by the side of the table upon which the body lay, and noting how white the profile showed in the deepening gloom, he laid his arms upon the table's edge and dropped his face into them, tearless yet and unutterably weary. At that moment it came in through the open window, a long, wailing sound like the cry of a lost child in the far deeps of the darkening wood. But the man did not move. Again and nearer than before sounded that unearthly cry upon his failing sense. Perhaps it was a wild beast, perhaps it was a dream, for Murlock was asleep. Some hours later, as it afterward appeared, this unfaithful watcher awoke, and lifting his head from his arms, intently listened. He knew not why. There in the black darkness by the side of the dead, recalling all without a shock, he strained his eyes to see, he knew not what. His senses were all alight, his breath was suspended. His blood had stilled its tides as if to assist the silence. What had waked him, and where was it? Suddenly the table shook beneath his arms, and at the same moment he heard, or fancied that he heard, a light, soft step. Another. Sounds as of bare feet upon the floor. He was terrified beyond the power to cry out or move. Perforce he waited there in the darkness, through seeming centuries of such dread as one may know, yet live to tell. He tried vainly to speak the dead woman's name, vainly to stretch forth his hand across the table to learn if she were there. His throat was powerless. His arms and hands were like lead. Then occurred something most frightful. Some heavy body seemed hurled against the table with an impetus that pushed against his breast so sharply as nearly to overthrow him, and at the same instant he heard and felt the falling of something upon the floor, with so violent a thump that the whole house was shaken by the impact. A scuffling ensued, and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. Murlock had risen to his feet. Fear had by excess forfeited control of his faculties. He flung his hands upon the table. Nothing was there. There is a point at which terror may turn to madness, and madness incites to action. With no definite intent or no motive but the wayward impulse of a madman, Murlock sprang to the wall with a little groping, seized his loaded rifle, and without aim discharged it. By the flash which lit up the room with vivid illumination, he saw an enormous panther dragging the dead woman towards the window, teeth fixed in her throat. There were no darkness blacker than before, and in silence, when he returned to consciousness, the sun was high and the wood vocal with songs of birds. The body lay near the window, where the beast had left it when frightened away by the flash and report of the rifle. The clothing was deranged, the long hair in disorder, the limbs lay anyhow. From the throat, dreadfully lacerated, had issued a pool of blood, not yet entirely coagulated. The ribbon in which he had bound the wrist was broken, The hands were tightly clenched. Between the teeth was a fragment of the animal's ear. And finally, a house that was empty by daylight is something else after dark. A place the locals simply called the Spook House and left alone. On the road leading north from Manchester in eastern Kentucky to Boonville, 20 miles away, stood, in 1862, a wooden plantation house of somewhat better quality than most of the dwellings in that region. The house was destroyed by fire in the year following, probably by some stragglers from the retreating column of General George W. Morgan, when he was driven from Cumberland Gap to the Ohio River by General Kirby Smith. At the time of its destruction, it had 4 or 5 years been vacant. Fields about it were overgrown with brambles, the fences gone, even the few quarters and outhouses generally fallen partly into ruin by neglect and pillage. For the blacks and the poor whites of the vicinity found in the building and fences an abundant supply of fuel, of which they availed themselves without hesitation, openly and by daylight. By daylight alone, after nightfall, no human being except passing strangers ever went near the place. It was known as the Spook House. That it was tenanted by evil spirits, visible, audible, and active, no one in all that region doubted any more than he doubted what he was told of Sundays by the traveling preacher. Its owner's opinion of the matter was unknown, and he and his family had disappeared one night, and no trace of them had ever been found. They left everything: household goods, clothing, provisions, the horses in the stable, cows in the field, the blacks in the quarters, all as it stood. Nothing was missing except a man, a woman, 3 girls, a boy, and a babe. It was not altogether surprising that a plantation where 7 human beings could be simultaneously effaced and nobody the wiser should be under some suspicion. One night in June 1859, 2 citizens of Frankfort, Colonel J.C. McArdle, a lawyer, and Judge Myron Vey of the state militia, were driving from Boonville to Manchester. Their business was so important that they decided to push on, despite the darkness and mutterings of an approaching storm, which eventually broke upon them just as they arrived opposite the Spook House. The lightning was so incessant that they easily found their way through the gateway and into a shed, where they hitched and harnessed their team. They then went to the house through the rain and knocked at all the doors without getting any response. Attributing this to the continuous uproar of the thunder, they pushed at one of the doors, which yielded. They entered it without further ceremony and closed the door. That instant they were in darkness and silence. Not a gleam of the lightning's unceasing blaze penetrated the windows or crevices. Not a whisper of the awful tumult penetrated the windows or crevices. Not a whisper of the awful tumult without reached them there. It was as if they suddenly had been stricken blind and deaf, and McArdle afterwards said that for a moment he believed himself to have been killed by a stroke of lightning as he crossed the threshold. The rest of this adventure can well be related in his own words from the Frankfort Advocate of August 6, 1876. When I had somewhat recovered from the dazing effect of the transition from uproar to silence, my first impulse was to reopen the door which I had closed, and from the knob of which I was not conscious of having removed my hand, I felt it distinctly, still in the clasp of my fingers. My notion was to ascertain by stepping again into the storm whether I had been deprived of sight and hearing. I turned the doorknob and pulled open the door. It led into another room. This apartment was suffused with a faint greenish light, the source of which I could not determine, making everything distinctly visible, though nothing was sharply defined. Everything I say, but in truth, the only objects within the blank stone walls of that room were human corpses. In number, they were perhaps 8 or 10, and may well be understood that I did not truly count them. They were of different ages, or rather sizes, from infancy up, and of both sexes. All were prostrate on the floor, excepting one, apparently a young woman who sat up, her back supported by an angle of the wall. A babe was clasped in the arms of another, and an older woman. A half-grown lad lay face downward across the legs of a full-bearded man. One or two were nearly naked, and the hand of a young girl held the fragment of a gown which she had torn open at the breast. The bodies were in various stages of decay, all greatly shrunken in face and figure. Some were but little more than skeletons. While I stood stupefied with horror by this ghastly spectacle, and still holding open the door, by some accountable perversity, my attention was diverted from the shocking scene and concerned itself with trifles and details. Perhaps my mind, with an instinct of self-preservation, sought relief in matters which would relax its dangerous tension. Among other things, I observed that the door that I was holding open was of heavy iron plates, riveted, equidistant from one another, and from the top and bottom, 3 strong bolts protruded from the beveled edge. Turned the knob, and they were retracted, flush with the edge, released it, and they shot out. The spring lock. On the inside there was no knob, nor any kind of projection, a smooth surface of iron. While noting these things with interest and attention, which has now astonished me to recall, I felt myself thrust aside, and Judge Vey, whom in intensity and vicissitude of my feelings had altogether forgotten, pushed by me into the room. "For God's sakes," I cried, "do not go in there. Let us get out of this dreadful place." He gave no heed to my entreaties, but, as fearless a gentleman as lived in all the South, walked quickly to the center of the room, knelt beside one of the bodies for a closer examination, and tenderly raised its blackened and shriveled head in his hands. A strong, disagreeable odor came through the doorway, completely overpowering me. My senses reeled. I felt myself falling, and a clutch at the edge of the door for support pushed it shut with a sharp click. I remember no more. 6 weeks later, I recovered my reason in a hotel at Manchester, whither I had been taken by strangers the next day. For all these weeks I had suffered from nervous fever, attended with constant delirium. I had been found lying on the road several miles away from the house, but how I had escaped from it to get there I never knew. On recovery, or as soon as my physicians permitted me to talk, I inquired the fate of Judge Vey, whom, to quiet me as I now know, they represented as well and at home. No one believed a word of my story, and who can wonder? And who can imagine my grief when, arriving at my home in Frankfurt 2 months later, I learned that Judge Vey had never been heard of since that night? I then regretted bitterly the pride which, since the first few days after recovering my reason, had forbidden me to repeat my discredited story and insist upon its truth. With all that afterward occurred, the examination of the house, failure to find any room corresponding to that which I described, the attempt to have me adjudged insane, and my triumph over my accusers, the readers of the Advocate are familiar. After all these years, I am still confident that excavations which I have neither the legal right to undertake nor the wealth to make would disclose the secret of the disappearance of my unhappy friend, and possibly of the former occupants and owners of the deserted and now destroyed house. I do not despair of yet bringing about such a search, and it is a source of deep grief for me that it has been delayed by the undeserved hostility and unwise incredulity of the family and friends of the late Judge Vey. Colonel McArdle died in Frankfurt on the 13th day of December in the year 1879. Bierce never claimed these things were true. He only claimed they were reported. In the places where the trees still grow thick and the roads run thin, that distinction doesn't always matter. Vanessa tonight, I'd like to thank you for joining us. Like, comment, subscribe. My name is Philip Zabesky. Come back. Join us. Another story hour. Or 30 minutes. Whatever. Good night.